Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata here, back with you. Let me just get my notes together. This is actually going to be a little bit of a different one. Usually I come with very concrete things for these live lectures, and this one's going to be a little bit different. It's actually one that I've had on standby for months now. I've just been putting it off for various reasons, but it's an extremely important topic in my mind where I often see, for example, Catholic apologetics in that sort of realm, and so much as I ever look into it, they tend to misconstrue this particular subject, at least historically. And I wanted to give it a shot to take a shot at it here, if you will, for your own edification and maybe for your entertainment. The problem is that it's admittedly just such a vast, almost vague, abstract topic that pulling it all together, getting the resources together is kind of a monumental task. It's part of it's part of the reason why I sort of put it off, but it's also especially challenging because my goal is to make this like a one-off sort of comprehensive live, but fool that I am, I tend to rush into these things. I don't see myself not being able to finish this today, but we'll see what I actually get through and how much of these sort of like concrete ideas that I can bring into it. Now, I want to say I'm going to do my best to not make this necessarily an apologetics work. And this may not even be like popular with some of you guys. Most of the time that I spend on social media per this particular channel is on Twitter. And then I'll see occasionally comments in YouTubes and things like that. And it seems like apologetics and defending the faith is sort of the like big game that everybody's playing. And when you step into subjects that I find interesting, I'm liable to be hit with, well, why don't you debate this person or why don't you go after this person? And that's not, I mean, I generally just have no interest in that, right? There's a lot of things I'm not interested in that it seems like a lot of people on social media in the Catholic world and the Protestant world and the Orthodox world are just crazy about. So when it comes to something like a debate, to me, I mean, my wife says that I love to argue, right? And I'll take her word for it. I don't see myself as the most argumentative person in the world, but to me, an argument is like a group of buddies get together and we go out for a drink and we're just being guys. We're arguing over stuff, right? It's not this like, you know, Thunderdome, two men enter, one man leaves. That's not like Mad Max in the Thunderdome, where we just go out and we just sort of hammer each other, and one person walks out victorious, and that is the victorious way of the faith. I have no interest in that whatsoever. But I do like some of these subjects that kind of blur into, okay, this is an argument that Protestants make, and how do we Catholics respond to that? This is an argument that the Eastern Orthodox make. How do Catholics respond to that? And I have a lot of works when it comes to this particular subject that I want to reference. I really had to kind of dwindle it down just for the sake of a single lecture so that the talk wouldn't drift too far. And I have to say, it is a challenge, guys. For those of you that don't do this, that don't make content, to kind of come on a live like this with as few notes as I come with and not detour too often and take the subject off to some like crazy realm that I want to cover, which I'm very prone to do and I am very tempted to do at all times. I'm going to here use a few references and I'm going to give them to you just in case you want to like dive into this stuff a little bit deeper yourself. Though, I mean, you could fill bookshelves with the subject of church and state. But for example, one really good reference that I would point you to is the History of the Byzantine State by Ostrogorsky. I think his last name is George Ostrogorsky. It's a classic work. And you really do, I think, as Christians, even as Catholics, we have to contend with the Byzantine state and what that was, especially from like Constantine forward, what that was for Catholics as we were sort of developing many of our ideas. That's an important one that we have to look at. So his history of the Byzantine state is like a classic work on the subject. In many ways, the Byzantine state apparatus was modeled on the former Roman state, and through those first tolerance acts, and later by making, Christianity the state religion, that interplay between emperor as an orthodox or emperor as a heretic and how that affected the church is very important. Another one, and I say it's an absolute must read, is Russia and the Universal Church. Now, I have been very influenced over the years by Solovyev's thought. And I mean, no shame in admitting that. I get some of my ideas directly from him, and I point people to him quite often. Soloviev was just this great 19th century Russian thinker. He was Orthodox, though he seems to have, at least interiorly, switched to Rome, if not actually converted to the Roman faith. There's a lot of controversy surrounding that, but wonderful thinker, brilliant man, interesting man. I wish I could have had the chance to sit at his feet and listen to him lecture. But his Russia and the Universal Church, I think, is an absolute must for this. I'm just looking on my bookshelf right now to see if I got anything else I would recommend by him. That just for this particular subject is one that's worth reading. Two that I recommend to, as we have to sort of account for the Anglicans, who, in some ways, in my opinion, actually make better arguments at times than our Eastern brethren do. Probably some of the most robust that I could offer to you here. One is Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars. Excellent, excellent work. Another is Jaland. It's a book called The Papacy and the Church. Eric Ibarra recommended that one to me a long time ago, and it's a wonderful work. He's an Anglican himself, but he does a great job of sort of expressing some of the challenges for both sides. I would say Jaland is a fairly unbiased author in a high respect. We also have various classical works. You have Bede's History of the English People. You have Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History. You have Gregory of Tours and the History of the Franks. You have various chronicles of the Middle Ages. There's just a lot, right? And that's to say nothing of the state and the abstract that we get from the ancient world, like ancient Greece and Rome. And those thinkers, you have Plato's Republic, you have Aristotle on government, you have Plutarch's Lives or Cicero's speeches, et cetera, right? I want to focus in this lecture on what is the relation between the state and the church, whether or not national churches, which we would have to define in a little bit here, whether or not national churches are a bad thing. And should we exclude them at the cost of a universal church as we are Catholics? Again, I know this is broad in its scope, but I believe I can extract a few lessons here that may help you guys sort of fine tune the points that Catholics make when we engage in others, especially Protestants and Eastern Orthodox, both of whom kind of hinge the structure of their churches, even in so much as there's notions of a universal church within their ecclesiology. The functions of the state in many ways works in ways that you just don't see in Catholicism. And at the same time, the phenomenon of Caesaropapism has come fraught with many problems and controversies of its own that they really have to contend with. On the other side of that, though, I see Catholics at times dismissing Protestants and Eastern Orthodox for their ties to national churches, which are, ultimately tied to their national identities, when we have very similar instances of such in our own past, right? Not long ago in the United States, for example, it would have been on full display for people. You'd go into these parishes in large urban areas that were marked by their ethnicity. Poles went to Polish churches, Irish went to Irish churches, Italians to Italians, and so forth. There wasn't this universal intermingling, even if we did have a unitive faith under the visible head of the Pope. So it's a bit disingenuous or ignorant when Catholics lodge complaints at others for what we ourselves really did until recently. Now, a subject like this certainly has theological implications, which is usually where I tend to travel down in these live talks. But as you guys know, if you followed me for any length of time, I try to use my skill, in so much as I have a skill at this, my skill at penetrating the historical contexts to pull out subsequent theological insights, because no theological insights are born just out of a vacuum. There's always historical context. And that's my, if I could give, I'll probably add this to like one of my little quick tips for studying history. If you're interested in studying theology, you have to have the historical context right. But one thing I want all of you to do to make sure you're doing this in your discussions with people, because in today's discourse, we cannot assume that everyone is using univocal terminology. When someone says they want to return to tradition, ask them actually to define what tradition is. Ask them to tell you what the truly traditional era of the church is. And you'll find that many people have a very modern view of a traditional world. I'm actually going to do a talk dedicated on this subject later, but most people, when pressed with the realities of what life was like for most humans for the vast majority of history, to quote Hobbes, life was nasty, brutish, and short. You ask me what would I have been at my age in the Middle Ages? I probably would have been dead. That's what I would have been in the Middle Ages. Most people have in their mind a return to tradition that includes many of the products of the Enlightenment, like a high degree of autonomy and independence, sanitation, regulated working conditions. You'll hear a lot about the nuclear family or a 9 to 5 dad and a stay at home mom, all of which are really modern concepts. So if we want to return to the traditional state as such, as we have always as we're always hearing people say, we have to ask, what does that even mean, right? Do we could begin with Greece, with the city state and the concepts that develop around Athens. You could turn to the Roman Republic and the empire. You have those major cities of antiquity like Rome or Carthage or Alexandria or Ephesus or Antioch or later Constantinople. You could turn to the medieval cities, which, as an interesting little aside, none of the major medieval cities, with the exceptions of Rome and Constantinople, were on the map in the ancient world. They develop under a completely different world coming out of the fragmentation of Europe after the collapse of Rome. But cities like Paris, London, Cordoba, Florence, Venice, the Venetian city was an exceptionally fascinating story, but so on. These type of cities that come out of the medieval world. Later, you see the emergence of the Slavic states, most importantly, the Rus in Kiev and Moscow. Now, I'm naming cities here, all right? And this is important because another thing that we have to contend with today is that we're living through kind of a unique period in history. And I do have a cough drop in, guys, so sorry, you have to bear with me with that a little bit here. It's almost gone. This is a period where we see large swaths of people pulling away from their sort of ancient allegiances to the notion of the city state, and you begin to see the emergence of nations and national identities. In the year 1100, you wouldn't have really seen yourself as an Englishman or a Russian or a Frenchman or whatever. At best, at best, you were under someone who claimed for themselves the title of emperor of the old Roman imperial title, but nothing like what you see later with these sort of national identities and the kind of patriotism that would surround these large expanses of land that we come to see in later times. That really comes as a result of, in response to, but also intrinsically bound up within the Protestant Revolution. Because the Reformation was a return in many ways to the old heap that we had for a short, brief window sort of pulled ourselves out of, where a religious people were united around a singular religious head, that being the papacy, who was able to call upon multi ethnic peoples to unite under the cross and actually go fight in crusades. And I don't think that many of you realize just how unique the papacy is in history and what it managed to accomplish. Well, all of this is torn asunder by the rising of the nation states that really begins with the 30 Years' War and ultimately culminates in World War One, in my opinion. In my opinion, I think we are living on the tail end of that relatively brief couple of phenomenons where, allegiances were first united under and centered around the papacy, which then falls apart to the second thing, which is the formation of these large nation states, which is itself in the modern era, at least since after World War One, itself falling apart. And I think we're actually reverting back to the old city-state alliances, which are honestly much easier to manage and control. So we're sort of past two unique eras. One that united around the papacy and one that united around the nation. Now, of course, in the mix of all of this, at least with modernity, you have things like globalism that complicate things. But that, in my opinion, is kind of coming to an end as well. But that's a digression. I'll have to come back to that at another point. The sole purpose of this lecture is for me to try to express that when we discuss these things, we are very often arguing around each other because, this person over here is focused on this thing, and this person over there is focused on some other period and concept where they're using the same terminology, they're using the same language, but they're using them to speak of very different realities. And a lot of times I see this happening when you find Anglicans or Catholics arguing with each other, for example. Another example that we often find in history on both sides, let me give you a concrete example of this. We see at the Synod of Whitby, 664, where King Oswy clearly presided over and basically by monarchical dictate declares the English church to be henceforth under the Roman calendar. But at the same time, as Bede and others attest, we have the monarch Oswy in agreement with St. Wilfrid, who's venerated in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Anglican Church, and the Catholic Church, and the other bishops present, that the Bishop of Rome has direct and universal jurisdiction over these matters. St. Wilfrid was there representing the Roman position. And hence the synod settles the Ionian Easter controversy based on what Rome itself has already declared. And one thing I want to point out about this, one thing I don't see Catholics do so much, but I definitely see Eastern Orthodox and Protestants doing this. And if you see it from any side, you need to call it out as it's a really bad argument. So how do I present this? When you see a people in an area doing X, whatever X may be, when they're doing X thing after the papacy has condemned X, and then someone says, "Oh, look at those people over there. They're doing X." And the Pope said not to do that. But the people are doing that. So therefore the Pope is false. So for example, you'll see Anglicans say, "Hey, look, England before the Gregorian mission, man, they were their own church. They were independent. They did what they wanted. And when the missions did come in, no one listened. So therefore, no Pope." I'm making a caricature, but when you historically dive into that argument, what do you find? Well, the one thing that we know about England at that time is that the predominant faction was the Pelagians. We have early reports that the heresy was run rife all through modern day England and Wales. Now, when an Orthodox party arrives and says, "Hey, the Pope in Rome says you're all heretics," from St. Germanus on up through, men recognized by saints as both Catholics and Anglicans, where the Roman position has never been that in order for our side to be correct, that these heretical or pagan groups just have to say, "Oh, yep, you're right. Sorry. We made a mistake. We submit." And then we turn another leaf and then they go on about their days. That's just not how history works. Missions take time in any circumstance. And even in the best of circumstances, even up to our very own day, we have a hard time enforcing orthodoxy on multiple fronts. And I'll get back to this in a minute, but we don't claim that, a Germanus or an Augustine of Canterbury arrive, lay down the law, and then all the Pelagians just comply. But this is what I've heard Anglicans say, that like because it shows that England was independent and just didn't recognize Rome. No, actually what it shows is that the people were obstinate in their heresy and we both agree that Pelagianism was a heresy. All this proves is that you had a bunch of clergy who refused to submit to objective truth when it was presented to them. And you'll hear this from the Eastern Orthodox as well. That the Eastern bishops, for example, they didn't just submit to Leo's tome at Chalcedon. They read it and they discussed it. But that does not prove that A, Leo's tome wasn't objectively true, and that B, he intended it to be submitted to. Had those bishops at Chalcedon returned back from their deliberations having rejected Leo's tome, do you think the great Pope Saint Leo would have just said, "Oh, well, you know what, guys, they talked about it and they decided against me, so be it." So we accept that people, that kings, that bishops, etc., at times challenge or outright reject Rome. It's clearly there. The question is, are they right in doing so? That's the big question. But all things considered, obviously, here I am a Catholic, and I think that history weighs on our side when one considers both sacred scripture and the historical evidence. But Catholics do have to contend with the very intimately involved state apparatuses that dominated the Christian church through much of history. Even with the Gregorian reforms, it wasn't so much about stopping kings or nobles, or even at times the people through acclamation from selecting from their ranks the persons they wanted to be elevated to the episcopacy. No, but the Gregorian reforms, it was about who actually invests the bishops. So while ideally I think we would want the church to have a high degree of autonomy from the state in selecting the best choices for our shepherds, taking into consideration the flock over, say, hereditary rank or state ties, I am not against Christian countries, especially with Christian rulers, picking the person so long as the local church and ultimately Rome approves the choice. Now, this admittedly becomes really tricky, and all of these things, look, governing is a hard thing, folks. If you have ever been in a position where you have to make choices for large groups of people, you understand exactly what I'm getting at. Governing is not an easy thing. And I actually am sympathetic to people that govern for the simple fact that I understand how confusing it is to make good choices and then have those choices followed and obeyed and not misrepresented. Look, I've been in situations where on small county local decisions that were being made, I would be behind the scenes seeing the decisions that were being made. Then you would turn to like social media when the decision became public, and all of the public is like getting the whole thing entirely wrong, and they're spreading these false rumors about why the decision was made and what the intent of these people were, and blah 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 blah. And so the people, a lot of the times, the people that are governing are just trying to make the right choice. Now, I'm not saying there aren't nefarious people that are trying to make nefarious choices, but even those nefarious choices in their mind, they usually convince themselves that it's a good choice. But I have seen where the public actually gets these things wrong. Now, it becomes really tricky when you're dealing with non-Christian countries and rulers because, we have the recent issue with the Chinese Communist Party and their dealings with the Vatican. Or we have the historical example of the Patriarch of Constantinople for centuries being appointed by the Sultan, more often than not for politically expedient purposes, like most glaringly when Second appointed Scalarius for the express intent of destroying the Christian victory of unity at the Council of Florence, ultimately solidifying the schism. I mean, and Mehmed said he sought out the most anti-union clergy he could find and put them into the positions of power. Now, does that destroy the Eastern Orthodox claims? No. But it does present real significant challenges that they can't just hand wave away. When you have the last Christian emperor of Constantinople of the East agreeing and ratifying the conciliar decrees of Florence, only to have them overturned by a heretical Prince Mehmed conspiring with an anti Florentine party in Greece, leaving alone if you think that as I heard one Orthodox monk put it one time, the machinations of Florence and the decisions that were decided there. Tabling that for a moment just aside, just the optics, right, of the last Christian emperor of the old Roman world before it disintegrated under the weight of the Turks, being in communion with Rome, agreeing to the conciliar decrees of Florence, having that overturned by the most powerful heretical prince in the world, Mehmed II, and the Turks under the Islamic Party, conspiring to rip us apart. You have to contend with that, Orthodox. I'm sorry, and it's not a good look, especially when you have the anti-Florentine party saying things like they would rather serve under the turban than the biter of Rome, or tiara of Rome rather. So this kind of gets at the very heart of the topic at hand today. And the fact is that the role of the state in Christianity has long been, in my opinion, the bane of our faith, as it has been for many others, Islam included. Islam has suffered under really bad leadership for a long time. Political factionalism, it's just a terrible consequence of man's inability to govern himself according to the laws of nature and nature's God. And all down through the centuries, we have the state at times consolidating and uniting the faith, but more often than not, terrorizing the faithful, especially their Christian neighbors. You'll have a so-called Christian rulers terrorizing Christian neighbors next door to them. For example, when the Spanish kingdom should have been united in their cause to push the Saracens out, they were too busy working with the infidels in their crusade against their Christian brothers. So the Reconquista isn't really actually a united thing till very, very late. Most of the Reconquista is actually Christians fighting Christians, often at times united with Muslims in the conquest of in the process of doing so. When the kings of Europe should have been crusading and fighting to recover all the lost parts of the old Roman Empire, they were warring with one another. And the same thing is in the East, where the Byzantines were constantly terrorizing their Miaphysite neighbors, so much so that when the Miaphysites saw the Muslims invading, they saw the Muslims as a respite, not as conquerors. The only example in history, and try to find me another example of something like this, I challenge you. The only example in all of history, before modernity at least, that was able to mobilize and rally Christians along this large expanse of land as a singular entity to unite around was the papacy. And this is one huge important reason why I think the papacy is so consequential, just historically. We've often here in America, especially, but in other places as well, those of us who remain loyal to the papacy are accused of being a fifth column within the state, subversive seeking to overthrow legitimate leaders. Now, that has always been hyperbole, but the fact is that at one time the papacy was able to call upon men to forsake their petty squabbles with one another and fight for a higher cause. And all you Deus Vault brothers out there, listen up, especially you ones that aren't Catholics. When the Crusades happened, it's not like there was just this like relative peace across Europe. The leaders of Europe were still engaging their own soldiers with petty disputes against one another. When Pope Gregory VII, a much maligned man, and his heirs freed the papacy and the clergy of Europe from Caesar, he started us down this path of a true closest that we've ever come to a Christendom, unlike any you've ever seen before or since. And even after the reforms that he sets into motion started to fray in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was still the papacy that united the Christians of Europe to set out and evangelize the world, be that through crusade or through missions. You never see the Eastern Orthodox doing that. Yeah, they kind of got into Russia a little bit. I saw the one guy, I didn't, it was so much like trying to contend with the reality of history. It just felt like cope. But I saw a couple years ago, I think his name is Ubi Petris or whatever his name is, trying to like make a case for Orthodox missions. It just doesn't play out in history. Eastern Orthodoxy is literally dying in its native countries and in the surrounding areas, with the sole exception of Russia. But even Russia is in demographic limbo. And even if you look at the numbers of those that actually attend church and are active in the church, it's not the Orthodox. In fact, Eastern Catholics are much more active in their faith when you look at statistics. And I don't care how many converts the Ortho Bros think they're winning, it's a fugazi. It ain't real, folks. Look at our numbers worldwide compared to theirs. Even if you just exclude all of the nominally Catholic people, look at the numbers and look at which countries it's happening in. We're in the countries where the demographics are. You only ever see Protestants attempting this after us. We, that is, we Catholics, brought the gospel literally to the ends of the earth. Catholics from all nations, united under a single head, we paved the way. And I think we actually stand on something of a precipice that's kind of phenomenal, guys. And I want to like draw your attention to it for a second because I think we're at a stage in history, world history, church history. We'll probably see it in a generation or two, and it's going to be unlike, I think, anything that's ever been seen before. And I'm talking about a truly emergent global religious movement that seems to be taking place. This is actually a book that I'm working on. I'm kind of in the early stages of it, but it's sort of an idea of how to unify this wide expanse of people under the headship of our queen, according to St. Maximilian Kolbe. It's to quote Donald Trump, it's big league, folks. Now, look, I am all for states that want to work with us. I am all for state rulers who are Christians seeking to help us in the cause. I'm all for you guys being patriotic and loving your country and loving your ethnicity and trying to work out, you know, trying to work within the country that you find yourself living in to make it a better place for us to live. But as Augustine admonished us many centuries ago, that we as Catholics should be both citizens of and wayfarers in any country we happen to be born in. One of the challenges I see is this, I'm going to call it the myth of Western Christianity. From the early days of the church, most people saw Christianity as an Eastern religion, with the exception of the seat of Rome, which was very, very important, no doubt. But until the rise of Islamic hegemony in the East, wherein after the West sort of stood alone as independent, up to that point, the East was really seen as the seat of Christianity. All of your major sees were in the East, with the exception of Rome. Then, after the rise of Islam, the West kind of stood alone as independent and subsequently become seen as Christianity itself. Now, for those of you that are struggling to maintain ethnic and national identity, and this is a big concern for you, don't latch on to Christianity as an exclusionary force for you to use for your own manipulative purposes for your small little clan. Look, Christianity in the Catholic Church absolutely can be a mark of your culture and your nation for sure, but it can't be done to the exclusion of your fellow Christian brethren. And I see this. I mean, I don't know whether, like, I hear people all the time say, well, that's just like online people. That's just the online Orthodox, or that's the online trads. It's like, but these people, okay, do they not really exist? Are they not real people? If they're out there and they've got a loud enough voice, they can do some real damage at times. And I see people, I've seen, it wasn't that long ago. I think it was Gideon Lazar had a post, and there was this like group of, I guess I'm going to assume Catholic traditionalists that were in his comments, like talking about how they would never receive from an Indian priest and how dirty and awful those people are. And it's like trying to protect the purity of white Christianity, right? We don't get to have that, like, it's not even that we don't get to have that luxury of having Christianity as a small little clan religion. It's not what Christ told us to go to the ends of the earth and all people. And as far as Catholics goes, that should be at the top of our list. That should be the number one thing that we are before we're Americans, before we're French or German or Chinese or whatever we are, we should be Catholics. And under that, everything else should flow from it. So again, I'm not saying, guys, look, I know quite a few of you are really concerned about the ethnic, the destiny of your ethnic identity and people. And I get it. I mean, like, you don't want to see, I had a young lady that attended my parish, really, really nice lady. She was originally from a Maronite parish. And I had a long conversation with her. She was Lebanese, and the Maronite parish is over towards the city. And I have never been there before, but I wanted to go attend it, and she was like, "Look, it's very insular, and if you're not Lebanese, you're going to be seen as an outsider." And she was, I mean, she being Lebanese herself, came to the Latin church because our Latin church was much more, the one that we attend is much more ethnically diverse. But that's the way that I see it. I understand the position that the Lebanese Maronites are in. They want to retain their own unique expression of their identity as an ethnic people and as a faith without it being too commingled and taken over by other people. And I get that. That's like a real thing to want to be protective of. Our parish, our Latin parish, happens to be, it's not like, I think it's just as cringe to try to force diversity on people as it is to try to force segregation on people. Our parish just happens to be diverse. It's not like we didn't go out to like reach out to, to be like an affirmative action parish or something like that. It just organically became, we have a large population of Hispanic people that are there and a large population of African people that are there, like actually from the continent of Africa. And it just so happened to be that it turned into an ethnically diverse parish. But I don't fault any of them in our own parish for wanting to preserve their own ethnic identity, even so much as we're all under the umbrella of the Catholic Church. And one last concept I wanted to leave you guys with before I finish up today. If you go back, I've mentioned this before, and I'm positive I'll mention it again because it's such a good thing to wrap your mind around when it comes to the Catholic Church, especially for those of you that are constantly just like worried and uncertain, and you're on the edge of jumping ship all the time to the other thing because you're just so worried about how dirty the Catholic Church seems. Well, look, in the very first chapter of Russia and the Universal Church by Soloviev, there's a chapter on two. It's a tale of two bishops, Saint Nicholas and I forget who the other bishop was. Anyways, they are both passed on and they're on their way to heaven. They've got their vestments on, their bishop's robes, and on the way to heaven, Saint Nicholas sees a young peasant family with their wagon stuck in the mud. St. Nicholas tells the bishop, we should go help those people before we go to heaven. The other bishop says, no, my robes are clean and they're going to remain clean, and I'm not going down there to get dirty to help those people. So St. Nicholas says, all right. So he goes down there and he gets his bishop's robes covered in filth, helping these peasant people whose wagon is stuck. So then when St. Nicholas actually arrives to heaven with this other bishop, the one being pristine and pure because he didn't actually get into the trenches, and St. Nicholas being covered in filth, the analogy there for Solovyov is that while one clean was also insular, was also cut off, was holding the fort, as you could say, but in the process of doing so, they not only become irrelevant, but they actually become sort of contra the gospel message. And I didn't listen to the whole thing, but I just happened to be listening. I rarely listen to his homilies, but I happened to be listening to a homily from Bishop Barron that he put out a day or two ago. And he was actually talking about this very thing where for us to be Catholics, we have to, like the Catholics have always been very good at getting dirty, doing the hard work, getting in the filth of the world. And while in doing so, we're not going to come out looking as pristine and clean as the Orthodox Church is in their sort of insular cutoff way. And even in the way I would say the Catholic traditionalists make the mistake of this, you are going to run the risk of getting filthy. And I mean that in the world, you are going to come out looking rather filthy at times. So it's always this balance between being in the world and not of the world. But you actually do have to be in the world. In the world does not mean that we wall ourselves off. And so when we come to places and countries that don't look European, their cultures are very different than ours. You're going to come out looking dirty at times as you evangelize these people. You are going to come out with a clown mask or two. And I'm sorry, but when we get to heaven, we are going to have some dirt on our clothes, but we'll have been right there in the trenches with Christ the whole time. And the other thing, and I'll end on this, because it's going to kind of lead me to next week's talk that I'm going to do on the Amazon Synod, is folks, we have to get used to the idea of a universal church. We are not an homogenous faith. We can't afford to be. And I know, again, I'm going to reiterate this and emphasize it. I know it complicates things. And I know that you want this like high degree of certainty, and that when things start looking funky to you and weird and out of place, just remember, Holy Mother Church is protected. She cannot lead us or others into error. We have to be willing at the same cost. The cost of it is the Holy Mother Church offers to protect us. We have to be willing to go in to yes, challenge these countries that people are in and the cultures that they're in, challenge the things that they take for granted, but at the same time be willing to accept certain cultural expressions of the faith, however weird or however not Anglo it may end up looking to you. And I'm gonna go about next week defending our brothers and sisters from the Amazon against the iconoclast detractors, both Catholic or otherwise, who have, in my opinion, really shamed and embarrassed us when what they did to our brothers and sisters Catholics from the Amazon when they came to Rome seeking help. But you'll have to tune in next week for that. So in the meantime, guys, that's what I've got for this one. There's quite a lot more that I could say that I want to say, but I'm going to leave it about 45 minutes there. I don't see any comments. I see Diego Cervantes at one point said both. That's kind of the gist of this entire lecture, right? I think we can both have our national identities, our ethnic identities, though I am of the opinion that national identities are starting to fray, and we'll probably be looking in the future at more local identities, right? I mean, the United States is kind of a, I don't know, the United States is kind of a tricky one because we never really have been culturally homogenous. And the idea of the states were in some ways like arbitrarily cut in the beginning. It's not like where you go over to Europe or some of these other places and it's like these ethnic groups that have been in these places for centuries, and they've been warring with this group over there for centuries. The United States is an interesting one, but I do think that I mean, just look at what's happening to the European Union. I mean, look at Brexit and some of the other things. I know political commentator Pat Buchanan has been saying that this is actually been happening for a while, at least since like the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was this sort of like, it was supposed to be this vast umbrella of all of these nations sort of coming together under the communist model, but that's all fallen apart. So that's what I got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it. And then since I'll give you just a second if you guys have any questions or comments. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Appreciate you guys watching. I have a really good, I'm really like, it's a really a special one for me that I'm going to be doing next week on the Amazon Synod, and I've already got my notes together for it. I'm super excited to give you guys that one, kind of related to this one. I'm also going to got some couple interviews lined up that I'm going to be doing. I'm excited about too, but I'm not going to announce who those people are till I've got some dates solidified. But anyways, guys, I see no comments, so all of you take care. God bless, and I will see you next time.